Good evening, guys and girls. Little ones, welcome to evening time.
You're doing well.
We're going back to something a little bit more traditional this evening. So I'm going to be reading from Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales. And this is actually a
I
tale...
thought the poo of pea.
The poo of pea? The
pea
cow of poo and the tay of piglet. No.
The poo of pea and the pea of poo.
I'm reading from this one.
Danish nightmares.
Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales. And this one, and this one is called The Goblin at the Grocer's. Do you know the Grocers? Do you know what that is?
No, but the goblin is a little creature. No?
A goblin is a little creature, like you've got goblins in Harry Potter.
Like it's a Smurf, but not
Smurf.
But not that cute, no?
Yeah, Smurf. I think
it's
Smurf.
more like a golem.
Yeah, more like a golem. And the Grocers is the place where you buy vegetables.
Mm.
Yeah. Anyway, so I haven't read this story before. The Goblin and the Grocers. There was a proper student. He lived in the attic and owned nothing. There was a proper grocer. He lived on the ground floor and owned the whole house. I didn't think grocers were rich. And the goblin kept well in with him because every Christmas Eve he was given a dish of porridge with a big lump of butter in it. The grocer could afford it. And the goblin stayed in the shop and found it very rewarding. One evening, the student came back by the back door to buy himself some candles and cheese. Having no one to send, he had come himself. He got what he asked for and paid for it. Good goblin. And he got a nod and a good evening from the grocer and the grocer's wife. This was a woman who could do more than nod. In fact, she had the gift of the gab. The student nodded back and then stood still, busily reading the sheet of paper that had been wrapped round the cheese. It was a page torn from an old book which should never have been torn up, an old book full of poetry. "There's some more of that," said the grocer. "I gave an old woman some coffee for it. If you like to give me a copper or two, the rest is yours." "Thanks," said the student. "I'll have it instead of the cheese. I can eat plain bread and butter. It would be a great shame if the whole of this book got torn up. You're a fine fellow and a good businessman, but you know as much about poetry as that bin." Now that was a rude thing to say. That was a rude thing to say. Especially about the bin. What? But the grocer laughed and the student laughed, for of course it was said sort of jokingly. But the goblin was shocked that anybody could dare to say things like that to a grocer, and one who was a landlord and sold the best butter. When night fell and the shop was shut and everybody in bed except for the student, the goblin went in and took the woman's gab. She didn't use it when she was sleeping. And whatever object in the room he put it on at once found its tongue and was able to express its thoughts and feelings just like the woman, though only one could have it on at once, which was just as well, for otherwise they wouldn't have been able to hear one another speak. And the goblin put the gab on the bin where the old newspapers were kept. "Is it a fact," he asked, "that you don't know what poetry is?" Why, of course I know, said the bin. It's the sort of stuff that's at the tail end of the papers and gets cut out. I fancy I've got more of it in me than the student, and I'm only a little bin compared to the grocer. And the goblin put the gab on the coffee grinder. Dear me, how it wagged. And he put it on the butter cask and on the till, and every one of them had the same opinion as the bin, and what the majority are agreed upon, you have to respect. Now for the student, said the goblin, and he crept quietly up the back stairs to the attic where the student lived. A light was burning there, and the goblin peeped through the keyhole and saw the student reading the tattered book from downstairs. But how bright it was in there! From the book came a ray of light which grew into the stem of a great tree that raised itself aloft and spread its branches over the student's head. Every leaf was so fresh, and every flower the head of a lovely girl. What? Some with dark and sparkling eyes, and others with eyes that were blue and wonderfully clear. Every fruit was a shining star, and the air was full of marvelous music and singing. No, the little goblin had never dreamt of splendor such as this, let alone seen or heard it. And he stood there on tiptoe, peeping and peeping till the light went out. The student must have blown out his lamp and gone to bed, but the little goblin stayed where he was, for the music played on softly and sweetly, making a delightful lullaby for the student as he lay down to rest. This is wonderful, said the little goblin. I never expected this. I think I'll stay with the student. But thinking it over again and being sensible, he said with a sigh, the student hasn't got any porridge. And so he went downstairs again to the grocer, and a good thing it was that he did, because the bin had used up nearly all the woman's gab in telling on one side what a lot he had in him, and he was just going to tell it all again on the other side when the goblin came and gave the gab back to the woman. I feel like I should explain this, the gift of the gab thing. Do you know that phrase? Mm-hmm. The gift of the gab is a colloquial phrase which means being very able to talk. But what he's done here is it's not even personify it. It's like make it into like a magic cloak that you can put on things.
And then they would talk to you.
And then they talk. But actually this gift of a gab is like a phrase, colloquial phrase. Okay, anyway, so we're back in the shop with the woman. But from then on, the whole shop, from the till to the firewood, took its opinions from the bin. And so great was their respect for it and their belief in it, kind of reminds me of American politics right now. And so great was their respect for it and their belief in it that whatever the grocer read out the art and theatre reviews from the paper, the evening one, they used to think it all came from the bin. But the little goblins no longer sat listening quietly to all the wisdom and common sense downstairs. As soon as the light shone out from the attic, the rays seemed to pull him like a strong anchor cable upstairs, and he would have to go and peep through the keyhole. And then there would come surging towards him a grandeur like that which we feel in the rolling ocean when God has passed over it in a storm, and he would burst into tears. Why he cried, he had no idea, but they would be tears of unhappiness. How very wonderful it would be to sit with the student under that tree, but it couldn't be, though he was glad of the keyhole. He went on standing there in the cold passage, even when the autumn wind blew down from the trapdoor in the loft, and it was so very, very cold. But the little fellow never felt it, not till the light in the attic was put out and the music had died down in the wind. Then, he would shiver and creep downstairs again to his warm corner where it was so snug and cozy. And then when Christmas came with its big lump of butter in the porridge, why then the grocer was a favourite. Now, in the middle of the night, the goblin was awakened by a terrible banging on the shutters. Somebody was banging away on them while the watchman was blowing his whistle. There was a big fire, and the whole street was aglow with it. Was it in this house? Or was it at the neighbour's? Where? It was terrifying. The grocer's wife was in such a state that she took her gold earrings off and put them into her pocket so as to save at least something. The grocer ran to get his bonds and the servant her silk mantilla. She could afford one. Everybody was bent on saving his treasures, and so was the little goblin. In a couple of bounds, he was upstairs and in the attic where the students stood in the open window, calmly watching the fire, which was in the opposite house. Seizing the wonderful book on the table, the little goblin stuffed it into his red cap and held onto it with both hands. The best treasure in the house had been saved. Then off he dashed, up onto the roof and right up the chimney where, lit up by the glow from the burning house opposite, he sat down, holding onto his red cap and the treasure inside it with both hands. Now, he did know where his heart lay and to whom he really belonged. But when the fire had been put out and he thought the matter over, well, then he said, "I'll divide my time then. I can't drop the grocer altogether because of the porridge." And that was perfectly human of him. We too go to the grocer for the porridge. That's the end of the story.
I didn't really get it.
No, really.
Can you sum it up for me? So there's
Okay, so the summary is that there's a house and there's a student in it and there's a grocer and there's a goblin.
and the bin.
But wait, those are the three kind of characters, and it's basically discussing who the goblin belongs to, and it's saying initially that whoever gives him tasty food is his master, or he chooses him to be his master. And then it says, because the contents of the book were so beautiful, that the student will be his master because he loves literature and art and beauty. And then in the end, he decides that he wants them both.
The grocer and the student.
Yeah, so he doesn't belong to only one of them, he belongs to both of them. And that was perfectly human of him because he couldn't give up the porridge. But I don't understand why it was important, A, that there was a gabbering, nattering woman whose treasure were her gold earrings that she had to take off to save them, because if she already had them on, then they would come out of the house with her.
Yeah, maybe it's
I mean, this is not a feminist text.
Yeah.
But it was a fairy tale, so I hope you enjoyed, as well as our rambling commentary. Join us again. Sleep well and take care of each other.